When the sun rose on that quiet morning, I already knew fate was about to demand a price I never imagined I would have to pay. It wasn't an empty premonition or some loose intuition drifting in the air. It was a deep certainty, the kind that's born in the heart of a woman who has carried the weight of the world alone more times than she will ever admit. The truth is, there are pains no one sees, efforts no one thanks, and love no one recognizes. And even so, we keep going. Because mothers learn early that love isn't measured by applause, but by the strength that remains when no one is watching. I was always there, present in the small moments and the big ones, in days filled with light and in storm-heavy midnights. I was the shoulder, the shelter, the safe harbor. The problem is that the quiet kind of love, the kind that gives everything without making noise, doesn't leave visible marks. It hides in the cracks of everyday life, in the repeated gestures, in the care that becomes routine. And when care becomes routine, the one who receives it gets used to it. The one who gives it gets worn down. And those watching from afar assume nothing is happening. But the weight was there. It had always been there. A weight no one sees, but that shapes the soul, bends the spine, and hardens the gaze just a little. A weight that grows even more when the person you protect the most becomes the one who wounds you without noticing. I carried that weight with the courage of someone who knows she cannot fall, because when a mother falls, the whole house collapses with her. I carried it without complaining, without asking, without showing. I carried it because I believed that love, even the invisible kind, would one day be understood. But that day took far too long to arrive. Sometimes I ask myself when silence became the enemy. Maybe it was when my words started being mistaken for harshness, when my warnings sounded like provocations, when my fear became something to be judged. The world doesn't teach daughters to recognize their mother's fear. It teaches them to hear only the tone of her voice, not the intention behind it. It teaches them to remember the yell, but not the embrace that came before. It teaches them to notice the flaw, but not the love that held everything together until then. And no matter how many years I spent trying to protect her, guide her, hold everything in place, none of that seemed to matter when someone decided to remember only the worst version of me. People forget the sleepless nights, the hands that comforted, the silent sacrifices, but they remember forever the single moment when pain rose up my throat and came out as a hard word. It's cruel, but it's real. And I had to learn how to face that reality without losing who I am. The weight no one sees hurts differently. It doesn't burn on the outside. It corrodes from within. It eats away at your confidence, your hope, your patience. It digs slowly until it leaves you silent. And that's how I became for a while silent. Not because I gave up, never that. I stayed quiet because I was tired of fighting a memory that wasn't mine. Tired of trying to explain what no one wanted to hear. Tired of carrying guilt that didn't belong to me. And even so, even in silence, I stayed. Because mothers learn far too early how to love past the point of exhaustion. Maybe you who are listening to me also know this kind of silence. A silence that isn't absence, but protection. A silence born from the exhaustion of being strong for too long. A silence that doesn't impose itself. It resigns. And if you know that place, then this story is yours too. I want you to write in the comments where you're watching from, because this pain and this love don't belong to any one city, state, or country. They belong to every woman who has been judged for her scars, but never recognized for her strength. I know many people will see themselves in what I'm about to tell, because quiet love is universal. The hurt, born from misunderstanding, is universal. The weight no one sees is universal. And the truth is, when a mother speaks, she speaks for many. So stay with me, because what happened next wasn't just a story. It was the unveiling of everything that had been hidden for years. It was the moment when truth finally found the courage to show itself. And when truth comes, it doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives. And that's exactly how it happened on the day that changed everything. A day that started like any other, but carried something different in the air. I felt it. My heart felt it. My spirit knew. And even without fully understanding what was about to unfold, I could already sense that life was preparing to place every piece where it belonged. But before that, I still needed to face an old pain, a hidden wound, a judgment I never deserved. And that's why you need to stay with me. Because this story will show what happens when a mother's silence finally finds its voice. That day, I felt something shifting between us, something so subtle it almost slipped past unnoticed, yet deep enough to mark the beginning of a distance I never wanted. It wasn't a harsh gesture or an offensive word, nothing obvious. It was just a look, quick, sideways, carrying impatience and mistrust, as if my words had lost the value they once held. I recognized that look because I had seen it before in other women, other families, in stories that once felt far away but were now standing at my door. It was the look of someone convinced they already know everything, someone who believes advice is interference, someone who confuses protection with control. And that was the moment the wound that changed everything began. She was growing up fast, and maybe I was slow to realize the world was speaking louder than I was. New friends, new opinions, new influences slipping into her life without warning, each one forming a layer around her that I couldn't break through with the ease I once had. I still tried to guide her, still tried to warn her, but every word of mine seemed heavier than it should have been, as if I had become the obstacle instead of the safety. This kind of thing tears a mother's soul in a way few people understand. We spend a lifetime building a solid path for our children, only to watch them choose the rocky ground the world offers, convinced that danger equals freedom. I watched her pull away slowly, and still tried to remain calm, tried not to smother, not to pressure, not to seem dramatic. But inside me, fear was growing. Fear of losing her. Fear of watching her make choices that would leave scars. Fear that if something went wrong, I wouldn't be able to reach her in time. I know you understand that kind of fear. That tightness in the chest that never leaves, that instinct that screams even when the mouth stays shut. And that's when everything began to unravel. Because when fear grows, it doesn't wait. It slips into your words, sharpens your tone, speeds your gestures. It makes you firmer than you want to be, louder than you should be, more intense than you ever intended. And the other person sees that intensity as an attack. They don't see love. They don't see desperation. They only hear volume. That's how she stopped listening to me. Not because I was wrong, not because my words didn't make sense, but because her heart was already closed to anything that came from me. I spoke with care, and she heard accusation. I tried to guide, and she received it as criticism. I said, "Be careful," and she heard, "You're not capable." It didn't take much for a simple conversation to become conflict. All it took was my concern for her to get irritated. All it took was me trying to protect her for her to feel invaded. And slowly, I realized the problem wasn't what I said. It was that I was the one saying it. This is the kind of pain that tears the chest open slowly because there's no quick fix. You can't stop being a mother. You can't stop loving. You can't just walk away and pretend you don't care. But you also can't stop someone from choosing the path they want. We try to find the middle ground, but it rarely exists. And when it exists, it doesn't last. Every time I tried to get close, the distance grew. Every time I tried to explain, she heard something else entirely. She said I wanted to control her life, when all I wanted was to make sure life didn't control her. But no one sees that. No one understands it until they feel it themselves. I remember one specific afternoon, an afternoon that could have been just another ordinary day, but instead became a quiet marker of our separation. I said something simple, something any mother would say, something with no intent to hurt. She looked at me with a coldness that didn't belong to my little girl, and with a firm, almost defiant voice, she told me she didn't need my opinion on everything. It wasn't the sentence that hurt. It was what lived behind it. What she really meant was, "I don't want to hear you anymore." These small emotional breaks are invisible to outsiders, but to a mother, they are earthquakes. And after an earthquake, nothing truly returns to its place. That moment stayed inside me like a quiet echo, returning every time I tried to talk to her. I started every sentence with caution, afraid of her reaction, avoided certain subjects, afraid of conflict, walked too softly inside my own home, as if I were an unwelcome guest. It wears you down. It erodes you. It consumes you. And even so, I stayed, trying to find little openings where our souls could still reach each other, trying to recover the girl who was slipping further away, trying to understand when I lost the right to be heard. Maybe you've lived something like this too. Maybe you tried to guide someone you love and were met with silence. If you have, write the phrase, "I understand this silence," in the comments. It isn't just a sentence. It's a recognition that this story isn't mine alone. It belongs to many of us. I never imagined love could be misunderstood so deeply. Never imagined my concern could become the reason for distance. But life has its strange ways. It shifts people. It changes the way they see those who have always been there. And the more I tried to pull her close, the more she pulled away, as if my touch burned, as if my embrace suffocated. It was like trying to hold sand in my hands. The tighter I held, the faster it slipped through my fingers. And it was this constant movement of distance that shaped what came next. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just the quiet wearing down that comes before a storm I didn't yet know was coming, but whose signs were already whispering in the air. Because where there is distance, there is fragility. And where there is fragility, any strong wind can turn into a hurricane. I felt something larger approaching, something I wouldn't be able to stop no matter how much I tried. And even so, I stayed, searching for a bridge between us, without realizing we were building walls at the same time. And those walls would be tested much sooner than I imagined, on a day that began as ordinary as all the others. I still remember every one of her falls, as if they happened yesterday. Small falls, big falls, falls she never even noticed, but I did. I ran to catch her before the world could hurt her, because that's what a mother does. She watches, she anticipates, she protects. Even when no one applauds, even when no one notices, even when the daughter believes she grew up on her own. There's a kind of love that doesn't show up in photos, that isn't recorded in videos, that doesn't become a pretty memory. It's the kind of love that happens in the middle of chaos, in the middle of the night, in the middle of exhaustion that makes the body tremble. That kind of love has no audience, only truth. I was there when she fell off her first bike, and swallowing my own fears, let her try again, even knowing the pavement was harsh and the world even harsher. I was there when she came home crying because a friend turned her back on her, and even though I wanted to fix everything, I just opened my arms and let her sadness melt into my shoulder. I was there for her first heartbreak, and even though I couldn't stop her pain, I made tea, fluffed her pillow, tucked the blanket around her, and waited for the storm to fade. But none of that shows up in photos. What shows up is the final result: a woman, convinced she built herself alone. I was there for every emotional collapse, the ones no one sees because they leave no bruises on the skin, but leave deep scars on the soul, like the night she lost something important and thought her whole world had ended. I sat beside her in silence, waiting for her breathing to steady. A mother's silence in those moments is the strongest embrace there is, even when there's no touch at all. But those memories, curiously, are never remembered. They disappear as if they were simply part of my duty, and maybe that's why they lost value in her eyes. But to me, they were everything. To me, each of her tears was a reminder that I needed to be even stronger. And even when I failed, even when my own life was too heavy, I never stopped being present. There were days when work swallowed me whole, when I came home with an exhausted body and a drained mind, but still refused to sleep before checking if she was okay. I'd pull up the blanket, fix her pillow, turn, off the light gently. These gestures were too small to become memories, too small to be remembered, but big enough to keep her safe without her ever realizing it. And that's how it was through every phase of her life. Adolescence, young adulthood, crises that came out of nowhere, impulsive decisions, mistakes made in haste or under someone else's influence. Every time she stumbled, I was there, even when she didn't call for me, even when she swore she didn't need me, because a mother's love doesn't wait for an invitation. It acts because it must. It shows up because it doesn't know how to disappear. And still, in her memory, what remained were my raised voices, harsh words spoken in the heat of someone terrified of losing what she loved most. Fear turning into urgency, urgency turning into a louder tone, and that louder tone becoming a permanent mark, while a lifetime of care faded into the background. There is a quiet injustice that walks alongside motherhood, an injustice that cuts deeper than any accusation, because it's born from unintentional ingratitude, No one teaches children to value what they never witnessed, what they never noticed, what happened in the hidden corners of everyday life. But I remember every detail, every gesture, every invisible sacrifice. I remember the times I didn't buy something for myself so she could have what she wanted. I remember the nights I stayed awake because she was sick or worried. I remember the moments I swallowed my own tears so she wouldn't see how tired I truly was. None of this shows up in photographs. But real love never needed a picture to prove it existed. I carried so much for her that I didn't notice when my own body started begging for rest. A lifetime balancing responsibilities, concerns, and fears, never realizing that in her memory, everything would be reduced to one single trait: the strict mother who yelled too much. That realization cuts deep because it feels like the story was told only halfway, as if the most important chapter had been torn out of the book. And still, I kept loving. I kept fighting. I kept believing that one day she would see the whole story, not just the part that hurt her the most. I remember a situation when she tried something new and failed. Her world collapsed, and I rushed in to hold the pieces together. She fell into my arms, saying she wasn't good enough, and even with my heart tight, I rebuilt her confidence word by word. But years later, that moment vanished from her memory. What stayed was a twisted sentence, spoken on a different day, in a different context, loaded with my own frustration. And that sentence became a symbol, a mark, a reference point, as if everything else had never existed. And that's what happens when love doesn't show up in pictures. It gets forgotten, distorted, erased. But the pain doesn't. Pain always finds room to grow. That's why so many mothers feel misunderstood, judged, lonely inside their own homes. Because they know they gave far more than they were ever recognized for. They know they loved far more than they were forgiven for. They know they carried more weight than anyone will ever admit. If you understand this, write in the comments, "I know the weight no one sees." That sentence is more than a comment. It's an embrace among women who love and suffer in silence. And as I sifted through those memories, one by one, trying to understand where our stories began to drift apart, I realized something that hurt more than everything else. No matter how many times I caught her before she fell, what she remembered were the few times I spoke firmly to keep her from falling again. As if the warning weighed more than the care, as if the raised voice had more power than the hands that always held her up. But life has curious ways of revealing hidden truths, and I didn't yet know that soon enough the emotional balance between us would begin to shift, not because I wanted it to, but because circumstances would be too strong for her to keep seeing only one side of the story. And it was exactly at that point, between erased memories and awakened pains, that something inside me began to move. Something I didn't fully understand, but that was preparing me for the moment that would change everything between us in ways neither of us expected. I always knew fear has a strange way of hiding inside us. It doesn't knock at the door, doesn't introduce itself, doesn't ask permission. It disguises itself, and mine, for a long time, disguised itself as anger. Anger not directed at her, but at everything I feared the world could do to her. Anger born from the terror of watching her repeat mistakes I knew too well because I carried the scars myself. She never understood that. To her, I was simply too strict, too intense, too firm. But no one sees the battle that rages inside a mother when she watches her child walk toward a cliff and realizes she can't pull them back. What she called yelling, I called warning. What she interpreted as harshness, to me, was desperation. I recognized the signs, the dangers, the traps. I knew certain choices had no return, that certain people had no good intentions, that certain doors, once opened, could swallow a person whole. But how do you explain that to someone convinced they already know everything? How do you protect without being accused of controlling? How do you love without being misunderstood? That's when I realized fear had taken over my words. I tried to be calm. I swear I tried. But there were moments when the urgency took control, and when I noticed my voice had already risen. She never heard the logic, only the volume. She never understood the intention, only the delivery. And so every time I tried to prevent a disaster, she only saw a mother who yelled too much, a mother who didn't trust her, a mother who suffocated her. And that created an emotional distance that hurt me in ways I couldn't even articulate. I remember one night in particular. She was about to make a decision I knew would bring painful consequences. I tried to talk, reason, show her what she refused to see, but the more I spoke, the more she shut down. Fear tightened my chest, and in the impulse of someone who loves too deeply, my tone rose, not offensive, not cruel, just loud, just firm enough to sound like an attack to someone ready to defend herself. She didn't hear the content, didn't hear the love. She heard only fear turned into sound. And that moment became one of the memories she clung to as proof that I was too harsh. People love to talk about strong mothers, but they forget that their strength almost always comes from the terror of losing what they love most. And when a mother fears losing her daughter to the world, to bad influences, to impulsive decisions, to treacherous paths, that fear turns into fire inside her. Sometimes it burns the throat. Sometimes it escapes as a warning that sounds too firm. Sometimes it comes out as a desperate plea that no one recognizes as love. And that's exactly what happened to me. I became fire trying to keep her from burning herself. And it's cruel to realize that among all the memories we built, the only ones she kept were the flames, not the warmth that always protected her. She forgot the times I defended her when no one else believed in her, forgot the nights I sat by her bed until sunrise, forgot the days I swallowed my own pain to tend to hers, forgot the quiet, deep, constant love. But she remembered every time my voice rose half a tone, as if those seconds mattered more than years of devotion. I know many women listening to me right now have lived this. They've been misunderstood, had their intentions twisted, been judged by people who only looked at the surface. If you know this pain, write in the comments, "I know what fear does to a mother." Because saying that isn't just agreeing with me, it's acknowledging a truth that spans generations. The worst part was that I didn't realize how deeply I was hurting myself while trying to save her. I thought my duty was to place myself between her and danger, even if it meant being seen as the enemy. But over time, I realized I was carrying a burden no one around me could see. Every raised voice she remembered came paired with a silent guilt I carried alone. A guilt that consumed me because I knew I never meant to hurt her. I only wanted to keep the world from hurting her. But she didn't see that. To her, I was the storm. To me, I was the umbrella. To her, I was the limit. To me, I was the shield. She couldn't see that behind every harsh word was the heart of a woman who had already seen too much, suffered too much, failed too much. I only wanted her to avoid the same pain. But fate has its own ironic ways of teaching. Sometimes it separates to later reunite. Sometimes it allows wounds to deepen so that healing will have room later. And I noticed that the emotional distance between us was changing. Something in me too. I tried to control my reactions, tried to speak gently, tried to approach without startling her. But fear is sneaky. It doesn't disappear just because you tell it to. It hides, waits, lurks. And when she made impulsive choices, trusted people I knew were untrustworthy, placed herself at risk, the fear inside me grew so loudly that I had no choice but to speak. And when I did, it sounded like anger. But it was love. It had always been love. The problem is that once someone decides you're the villain, nothing you do is seen as care. Everything looks like attack, and I felt that deeply. In the curt replies, the hard stares, the doors slammed as if to shut me out of her world. It was as if anything I said carried more weight than it should, as if I'd lost the right to warn her, as if my experience meant nothing. And that creates a loneliness only mothers understand, a loneliness that grows even inside a crowded house, because there is no pain greater than loving someone who sees you as a threat. And during that time, the wound between us deepened. She repeated that I yelled too much, repeated that I wanted control, repeated that I didn't trust her, but she never asked why a mother raises her voice, never wondered what lies behind a trembling tone, behind a worried expression, behind a firm word, never considered that fear is also a form of love. Maybe she would only understand that later, when life showed her that the world is far less gentle than it seems. But at that moment, I was just the mother she wanted to push away so she could feel free. And I realized those raised voices, what I saw as protection, had become for her a wall, a mark, a memory strong enough to erase everything that came before. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of a much harder chapter, a phase where invisible love and disguised fear would collide in ways that would reshape our lives forever, laying the groundwork for something neither of us could have foreseen. There came a moment when I understood that insisting was like pushing against a door she was locking from the inside. Every word I said felt heavy to her. Every attempt to get close became another reason for her to build another wall. I, who had always been the bridge, was now the road she avoided, and something inside me broke, not out of surrender, but exhaustion. Exhaustion from being cast as the villain in a story I wrote with love. Exhaustion from being accused of intentions I never had. Exhaustion from trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. So I did what no mother ever wants to do, but sometimes must. I stepped back. It was a quiet retreat, almost invisible to anyone who doesn't understand a mother's soul. But inside me, it was like tearing up roots that had been buried for years. I didn't abandon her. Never that. I simply stepped aside, letting her breathe without feeling watched, letting her make choices without my shadow nearby, letting life teach what my words could no longer reach. Silence for me was a form of tired love, a way of protecting without suffocating, a way of staying present without sparking more conflict. But to her, that silence became something else entirely. It became absence, indifference, supposed proof that I no longer cared. The cruelest part is that misunderstandings like that grow fast. They settle into the heart and build stories that were never true. She began to act as if I had given up on her, and that tore me apart inside, because I never did. I only found a new way to try to save her without her noticing. I watched from afar, hoping she was safe, searching for signs that she was okay. I remembered every warning I had once given and forced myself not to repeat any of them. My instinct was to run and interfere whenever something seemed wrong, but I held myself back, because every attempt to help became another reason for her to push me further away. That silence became my companion, a heavy silence, full of swallowed words, stored advice, hidden hurts. I got used to seeing her come and go without telling me anything. I got used to hearing her bedroom door close, knowing she preferred the world outside to any conversation with me. I got used to being the last option, when once I was the first refuge. And still, my heart stayed open. I watched her steps carefully, like someone tending to a flame that must not die out. All it took was the slightest sign that she needed something, and my mother's instinct lit up again, even when I forced myself not to act right away. I knew deep down she carried pains she didn't have the courage to admit. I knew there were insecurities hiding behind her firm posture, fears behind her quiet rebellion, but she never let me get close enough to touch them. It was like trying to reach someone through thick glass. I could see her clearly, but she saw only the reflection of her own shadows, and that created an abyss I didn't know how to cross. If I spoke, she stepped away. If I stayed silent, she took it as abandonment, and that duality consumed me. Many mothers will understand this. There is a kind of pain only those who love too much ever feel. The love that tries to protect and ends up hurting. The love that tries to help and ends up pushing away. The love that tries to speak and ends up silenced. And when that love grows tired, it retreats. Not out of surrender, but out of respect for the other person's space. If you understand this part of the story, write in the comments, "Silence is also love." That sentence carries a truth too deep for long explanations, but every mother who has stayed quiet to avoid losing her child knows exactly what it means. I watched the transformation happening before my eyes. She saw my silence as carelessness, and the more she believed I didn't care, the further she drifted away. I noticed the words she didn't say because I've known her forever. I saw the irritation disguised as independence, the longing disguised as coldness, the fear hidden behind reckless choices. She wanted me to run to her, but she wouldn't admit it. She wanted me to insist, but pretended she didn't want to hear me. She wanted to be taken care of, but felt ashamed of needing it. This emotional tug-of-war between wanting and rejecting is common in many children, but it cuts deeply in every mother. I tried small gestures to show I was still there. A dinner made without announcement, clothes folded without comment. A quiet look when I sensed something was wrong, but she saw none of it. And where there is no acknowledgement, pain grows. Mine grew in silence, hers grew in pride. And when two hearts hurt at the same time, but each believes the other is to blame, the distance becomes inevitable. And still, even in silence, I heard everything. The tone in her voice, the sighs, the little phrases she muttered in the corner of the house, thinking I wasn't listening, like she doesn't even care anymore, that sliced my soul into pieces. It was hard not to respond, hard not to explain, hard not to shout that I cared more than she could ever imagine. But I held myself back, because every attempt at explanation turned into an argument, every sincere word turned into accusation. So I embraced silence to avoid feeding the war, and it was that silence that became the turning point in our story. Not because I had chosen to step away, but because life decided it was time for her to see things with her own eyes. Maturity comes to some with time. To others, it arrives with impact. And deep in my heart, I knew she was about to face something that would change the way she saw me. Not because I wished for it, but because the world teaches with far more force than any mother ever could. What she didn't know was that my silence was never empty. It was a silence full of care, full of discreet watchfulness, full of unspoken love. I still checked if she got home safely, even when I pretended not to notice. I still paid attention to whether she was eating properly, even if I didn't comment on it. I still listened to her footsteps when she came in too late at night. I still got up quietly when I heard her crying in her room, but held myself back, respecting the space she insisted she needed. The silence she mistook for giving up was, in truth, the last resource of someone who had already tried every other way to love. And even so, even doing everything I could not to make things worse, I felt something bigger drawing near, something that would force each of us out of our positions, something that would shatter the emotional glass between us, something that would expose truths neither of us wanted to face, but that were already pushing their way to the surface. The kind of moment that alters the course of a story without asking permission. I didn't know when it would happen, or how, but I felt the tension in the air, the same tension that comes right before a severe storm. And when that storm finally arrived, silence would no longer be enough to protect anyone. I always believed that no matter how distant we were, life would still give me time to protect her, time to warn her, time to keep her from truly hurting herself. But fate doesn't follow our timing. It moves when it wants to, without warning, without mercy, without giving us a chance to prepare. And that's exactly how it happened on the day she fell, and I wasn't there. An event that still echoes inside me as if it had just happened. The kind of fall that changes everything, that disarms pride, that exposes vulnerability, that reveals the truth behind the walls we both built. I didn't find out about the fall right away. That day, her silence didn't grab my attention because silence had already become part of our routine. It was normal for her to come and go without saying anything. Normal not to seek me out. Normal to lock herself in her own world, convinced she needed to prove something to herself. But that silence carried a different weight. It was a silence that didn't just hide, it pleaded. I didn't hear the cry, didn't see the stumble, didn't witness the exact moment when everything collapsed. I only realized when fate, in its harsh way of teaching, placed in front of me the news I never wanted to receive. The information came through someone else, and for a moment my whole body stopped. It felt like time stretched, each second turning into an eternity. I heard the words, but my heart already knew before my mind processed them. She had fallen, and this time, I wasn't there to catch her. I wasn't there to soften the blow. I wasn't there to keep the world from splitting her in half. The feeling of not being present in that moment cut through me like a burning blade. The guilt came all at once, heavy, sharp, alive, as if reminding me that no matter how much I stepped back out of love, some distances cost far too much. I never imagined her collapse would come that way. She always seemed so strong, so independent, so determined to prove she didn't need me, that I believed even if she stumbled, she'd find her balance before falling. But pride weighs heavily, pressure weighs heavily, impulsive decisions weigh heavily, and when the world decides to collect its debt, it collects with interest. Her fall wasn't just physical, it was emotional, moral, spiritual, a fall that shattered all the certainty she thought she had, a fall that exposed all the fragility she had been hiding. behind a strong posture, a fall that revealed that despite wanting to appear grown, she still carried the vulnerability of a girl who needed comfort, even if she denied it. When I heard what happened, my body reacted before my mind understood. My hands trembled, my breath caught, my legs felt weak. It was as if my heart had been ripped from my chest, and at the same time, something inside me awakened. The instinct I had tried to silence for so long surged back in full force. The mother I tried, to restrain, to quiet, to respect boundaries, she came back whole. Because no matter how much a child hurts you, no matter how much they distance themselves, no matter how much they reject your advice, one moment of danger is enough to dissolve every barrier. A mother's love doesn't recognize distance. It recognizes urgency. I rushed to her with a speed my body didn't seem capable of, and on the way, every memory hit me like a blow. The raised voices she kept, the moments she erased, the silence she misunderstood, the attempts she dismissed. All of it suddenly felt small compared to the fact that now my daughter was down, and I hadn't been there. Maybe one of a mother's greatest fears is exactly that, not being present when her child needs her most. And that fear, which had once been just a thought, had now become real. When I finally found her, I didn't just see a weakened body. I saw broken pride. She had fallen in a way I never imagined I would witness. Her expression held shock, pain, and shame all at once. And in that moment, I realized life had struck deeper than my words ever could. The world had told her, in the harshest way possible, what I had been trying to spare her from for months. She wasn't ready. She wasn't as strong as she believed. She wasn't as protected as she imagined. And when our eyes met, I saw, for the first time in a long time, the girl behind the woman she insisted on pretending to be. That scene is carved into my soul. She tried to stand on her own, her hands shaking, her body giving out, stubbornness outweighing the pain. And for a moment, I stood still, realizing that any movement of mine could be seen as intrusion or as love, depending on how much pride she had left. But that day, pride was weak. Pain had taken its place, and before she tried again and collapsed once more, I stepped forward. I didn't say anything. I just approached slowly, offering presence before offering help, because sometimes the soul needs to feel it isn't alone. Before it accepts being held, she didn't ask me to hold her, but she didn't pull away when my hand touched her shoulder. It was a timid touch, almost invisible, but full of everything we hadn't been able to say for months. The touch of a mother who never stopped loving. The touch of a daughter who, for the first time, recognized she needed it. It felt like that simple gesture was the thread that tied our stories back together, if only for a moment. As I helped her to her feet, I felt her, weight, physical and emotional, lean into me. And it was then I realized that no silence, no distance, no misunderstanding was strong enough to cut the bond that always existed between us. The love was still there, buried under layers of pain, pride, and misinterpretation. But it was alive. Her fall wasn't just an accident. It was a calling, a turning point neither of us expected, but that life used to remind us of something essential. No one overcomes everything alone. No one carries all the weight of the world without breaking. No one is as strong as they pretend to be. And as I held her, I felt something shift in the air, something that told me that this fall wouldn't just be a moment of weakness, but the beginning of something bigger, something still forming, but already changing the way she looked at me, and in a way, changing the way I saw myself as a mother. It wasn't the time to talk, or correct, or explain. It was simply time to be, to feel, to breathe the same air without conflict, without accusations, without tension. Just two souls trying to find a path back to each other, even if neither of us fully understood that yet. But life, with its quiet way of revealing truth, was preparing something bigger, something that would turn that fall into the beginning of a revelation that would change everything between us. I knew that fall had opened a crack in her heart, small, almost invisible, but just wide enough for the truth to find its way in. Life has a curious way of revealing what we try to hide. And even though she had spent years building a distorted image of me, there were things that could never be erased, only forgotten. And forgetfulness loses its power when confronted with reality. That's exactly what happened in the days that followed. As she recovered, surrounded by gentler silences and by a presence of mind she no longer rejected automatically, fate was setting the stage for a revelation she had avoided for years. It all started in a simple way, as most important truths do. She was looking for a document, something ordinary, meaningless on its own. But she ended up finding an old box tucked away in a drawer she rarely opened. A box I had hidden there myself, believing that one day she would be ready to see what was inside. A box that didn't hold my secrets, just proof of a love she had insisted on denying. And when she lifted the lid, the scent of the past filled the air, the smell of folded letters, yellowed papers, silent memories that survived even when our relationship nearly didn't. Inside the box were letters I had written to her in difficult moments of her life, letters I never gave her because I thought they wouldn't matter. In some, I explained my fears, my mistakes, my intentions. In others, I simply wrote down how much I admired the woman she was becoming. There were messages I wrote on nights when she cried alone in her room, and I put on paper everything I wanted to say but didn't, afraid of making things worse. Words she had never seen, but that told the full story of what existed between us. The love, the care, the concern, the attempts, the failures, the successes she never acknowledged. She started reading slowly, as if each sentence were a small blade slicing through the pride she had carried for years, and every letter revealed a version of me she had refused to see. A mother who didn't raise her voice out of anger, but out of desperation. A woman who didn't control, but feared losing. A soul who didn't give up, but wore herself down trying to keep upright. Someone who kept pushing herself toward the edge. Tears began to fall before she could even try to hold them back. Old tears, stored tears, trapped tears. Tears that recognized the injustice she had placed on me, even without meaning to. And it wasn't just the letters. There were photographs she had never seen. Pictures of her sleeping with her head in my lap. Pictures of me following her from a distance when she went somewhere I felt was unsafe. Photos that showed presence, care, protective watchfulness. Photos that weren't taken to show anyone, but to preserve moments I believed she would want to remember someday. But she never remembered. And now, faced with those images, she couldn't understand how she had turned a lifetime of love into a distorted story built solely on moments of conflict. She also found a notebook. My notebook. A place where I wrote everything I was afraid to forget, everything I felt mattered for the future. There were pages where I asked God to give me wisdom to care for her, pages where I cried silently because I didn't know how to reach her, pages where I admitted my failures and asked the universe for forgiveness for not being the perfect mother I wanted to be. When she read that, her breathing grew heavy. Right there, faced with my most intimate truths, she was forced to acknowledge something she had denied for years. I was never her enemy, never the threat she imagined. I was simply human. I loved too much, and I loved the only way I knew how. And sometimes loving means getting it wrong. She found small objects that carried enormous meaning. One of her earrings I kept after she lost the pair and felt sad about it. A little note she wrote as a child saying I was her hero. A drawing she made saying I was her home. She had forgotten all of it, but I hadn't. Because mothers keep what their children throw away. They keep it because they know one day what was ignored will matter. Again. And when she held that drawing in her hands, something inside her finally broke open. The truth found its place at last. The revelation didn't come as a scream or an explosion. It came as a deep breath, the kind that cleans the soul. I wasn't in the room when she found the box, but I heard the sound of that breath from afar. It was the sound of someone finally seeing, the sound of someone realizing she had spent years fighting shadows she created herself, the sound of someone understanding. She had confused love with oppression because she didn't know how to translate a mother's fear. It was the sound of healing beginning. When she came to me, her eyes were still red. She didn't say anything. She just held the notebook and one of the letters, as if she needed physical proof that it was all real. She looked at me, as if she were seeing me for the first time, not as the strict mother she thought I was, but as the woman who had always been there, watching over her while the world tried to swallow her whole. And in that look, there was guilt, there was regret, there was understanding, But there was something even greater. Truth. The truth I had waited years for her to see. She didn't say it out loud, but her eyes said everything. Her whole life, she carried a story where I was the villain. But now, faced with the evidence, the memories, the love she had denied, that story began to collapse. And when a lie collapses, truth doesn't wait. It fills the entire space. It rebuilds, reorganizes, illuminates what was once distorted. If you've ever lived something like this, write in the comments, "The truth always comes," because that is one of the greatest certainties we carry. The truth finds its way. It may take time, but it arrives. It always arrives. She sat beside me without saying a word. This time, the silence wasn't distance. It was understanding. It was emotional digestion. It was her heart trying to process everything she had discovered. I didn't touch her, didn't speak, didn't ask anything. I just stayed there, breathing with her, allowing the moment to take the shape it needed, because revelation, when it comes, needs space. It can't be pushed, can't be rushed. It must be felt. And there, in that quiet moment, I realized we were about to cross the border that had separated us for so long. Something was about to happen, something that would forever change the way she saw me, and, in turn, the way our story would continue from that point onward. She sat beside me with that notebook closed between her hands, as if she were holding not just memories, but a new understanding of her own life. There was a different silence in the air now, one that didn't weigh us down, didn't divide us, didn't wound us. It was a silence that united, a silence that spoke louder than any words could. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, felt that the wall between us had begun to dissolve, not because I had done anything at that moment, but because the truth had finally found room inside her. And when truth finds room, it clears the way for connection. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a teenager, a vulnerable look, fragile, open. There was no anger, no defense, no pride. There was pain, and there was something even deeper than that, recognition. As if, for the first time, she finally saw the woman I had always been, not the character she had created based on incomplete memories. That recognition washed over me like a warm wave. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an apology. It was something far rarer. It was the meeting of two wounds that were tired of fighting each other. She held the notebook tighter, as if afraid it might slip from her hands, and said my name in a low, almost breaking voice. There was no accusation in that sound, only humanity, and that alone was enough to soften my heart in a way I didn't even know was still possible. I had always been ready to talk, but I never wanted to force a conversation she wasn't prepared for. Now, finally, she was, and in that moment, I understood that more than a conversation, what would happen between us was a mutual revelation, not of facts, but of souls. She took a deep breath, trying to sort through everything she was feeling. The tears came back, but this time they weren't tears of rebellion. They were tears of understanding, tears of someone realizing her judgments had been reckless, tears of someone discovering that the love she rejected was actually the most sincere love she ever received. I didn't touch her. I waited for the words to come, and when they finally did, they came like confessions. She said she had no idea of everything I carried, everything I hid so she wouldn't worry, everything I wrote down so I wouldn't lose my strength. As she spoke, I realized something that had never been so clear before. We were both exhausted from the weight of resentment, exhausted from the distance, exhausted from misunderstanding each other's signals, and that exhaustion created fertile ground for something new. A meeting not of speeches, but of wounded souls trying to find each other in the ruins built by pride. Her voice trembled as she admitted she never knew I watched over her from afar, never knew I wrote down my fears, never knew I hid my own pain, so she wouldn't carry more weight than she already did. I listened in silence because it was her turn to speak, her turn to let go of her defenses, her rigid certainties, the incomplete narrative she used to justify our distance. And as she opened up, something inside me opened too. I saw a woman who grew up believing she needed to be too strong, too independent, too cold just to avoid being hurt. I saw a girl who carried insecurities I didn't notice at the time because I was too busy trying to protect her from the world and not realizing I needed to protect her from herself too. She told me that for many years, She thought I raised my voice because I wanted to control her, that she believed my firmness was a lack of love, that she interpreted my warnings as attempts to keep her from living her life. But now, after reading everything, after revisiting memories I kept with such care, she realized my raised voice was the voice of a desperate woman trying to keep her daughter from being wounded the same way life had wounded her. And that realization made her break down in tears, tears I recognized instantly, because they were reflections of my own. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me too. So I just told her that I had always been afraid, afraid she would lose herself, afraid she would trust the world more than the world deserved, afraid her choices would leave marks too deep. And that because of fear, I spoke louder than I should have. I spoke with urgency when I should have spoken with calm. I spoke with desperation when I should have spoken with hope. She listened closely, for the first time in a long time. And when our eyes met, something new existed between us. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't resolution. It was recognition. And that recognition was enough to begin something new. When two pains recognize each other, they stop competing and start healing together. She realized her hurt didn't come from my lack of love, but from my lack of getting it right. And I realized my pain didn't come from her ingratitude, but from an emotional immaturity life hadn't yet allowed her to outgrow. And so, without raised voices, without accusations, without resistance, we sat there in the living room as two women wounded by life, trying to find our way back to each other. I could have listed every sacrifice I ever made. I could have reminded her of every night she slept peacefully because I stayed awake. I could have explained every choice, but I didn't, because I realized I didn't have to. The truth had spoken for me, and she heard it. She finally heard it. And in that moment, I understood that a new space had opened between us. A safe space, a possible space, a space where, for the first time in years, conversation could exist, vulnerability could exist, healing could exist. If you understand this kind of reunion, write in the comments, "When pain recognizes the truth, healing begins." That sentence holds the essence of that moment, because that's exactly what we lived. The beginning of a healing that didn't come from apologies or explanations, but from the recognition of shared pain. I felt that there was still so much to say, so many layers to unearth, so many knots to untie, but I also felt that the worst had finally passed. There was a new energy in the air, something lighter, more honest, more possible. And in that atmosphere, in that state of soul, a deep conversation began to grow between us, not shaped by the past, but by a desire to build a different future. And that conversation, I knew, would lead us to an even greater revelation, something that would completely transform the way she viewed our journey from that moment on. When that conversation ended, I felt something inside both of us finally settle. Not because everything was resolved, but because love, even wounded, found a way to breathe again. It's strange how, after so many words spoken and so many others swallowed over the years, what remains isn't the sound of the confrontations, but the silent vibration of the affection that never left. Time may try to erase some memories, but love has a stubbornness that defies all logic. It returns. It insists. It blooms in places where pain once swore it was impossible. As she held my letters and that notebook full of confessions I never had the courage to say out loud, I realized that destiny, somehow, had guided every step that brought us there. There was a new calm in the air, a serenity that didn't come from the absence of problems, but from the presence of understanding. It was as if our souls, tired from so much battle, finally decided to rest beside each other, without noise, without resistance, without the need to prove anything. And when she laid her head on my shoulder, something so simple, yet so rare in recent years, a soft warmth spread through my chest. That gesture, fragile and unexpected, said more than any long apology ever could. It was the ancestral language passed from mothers to daughters, the touch that heals without asking permission. I felt that this closeness didn't erase what we had lived, but illuminated what we could still build. The past doesn't disappear, but it finds its place. And among all the pain we collected, love was always the only sound that remained, even when it seemed suffocated by the noise of the world. The room was silent, but it was a full silence, full of memories, reconciliation, gratitude, full of everything that never fit into the harsh words we exchanged over the years. I closed my eyes for a moment and let that peace cover me. It wasn't the peace of perfection. It was the peace of truth. The peace that only arrives when two wounds recognize each other and finally decide to stop fighting. In that moment, I understood that life doesn't ask us to be perfect mothers, only present ones. And despite all the stumbles, I had always been there. Even when she couldn't see it, even when she refused to see it, she lifted her head slowly, took a deep breath, and looked at me with a different kind of light in her eyes. It was no longer the gaze of a wounded girl pointing fingers. It was the gaze of a woman who understood, who finally saw what she had denied for years, who realized that behind every raised voice was a heart desperate to keep life from breaking her. And in that instant, without either of us needing to say a word, truth settled between us once and for all. She only remembered the sound of my voice raised. But today, she finally heard the silence of my love. And it is that silence that now reaches you too, following my voice to the end. Not just to hear a story, but to feel the truth inside it. Because stories like this belong to many women, to many homes, to many matriarchs who carry old wounds and deep love. And if this message reached your heart in any way, leave in the comments, "Love still lives in me." That sentence is a reminder, an anchor, a seed that can bloom when life asks for courage again. But don't let this spiritual journey end here. The voice of the matriarch continues along other paths, other stories, other truths that also carry healing, strength, and revelation. Appearing on your screen right now is a new video, different from this one, but born from the same soul, the same wisdom, the same intention to touch something deep within you. Allow yourself to continue. Allow yourself to listen. Allow yourself to feel. The next video is waiting for you. The story changes, but the wisdom remains.